All right, I promise I will not be boring. That's what Tammy told me not to be, is boring. So, well, planners have a tendency to kind of go off kilter sometimes and ramble. And don't worry, I ramble really well. But I'll try to go over this. So this session is really about. I'm sure a lot of you already know this information, but I know you need to get your continuing education credits and things along those lines. So feel free to open up a newspaper and kick back and read during that portion. But just kidding. We'll go through and I'll try to give some stories about this. So first up, and if someone had copied this, it's been throughout the entire planning community, and so this is kind of what we go through. But uh, zoning dates back to 1922 with Amber Realty versus Euclid, the famous Euclid case that provided cities the opportunity and the ability to actually provide planning and zoning to each community. Within that case, there was an industrial company, Ambler, who was wanting to uh, continue to grow and develop their industrial facility. But the town of Euclid in Ohio said that they did not want to have that continued, and so they barred them through a community action through basically the town of Euclid's board to deny that. And Ambler, of course, appealed that to local and then all the way up to the Supreme Court. The local lower courts all agreed with Ambler, but the Supreme Court eventually overruled that, stating that it was within the police powers for the town of Euclid to continue to have that ability. And so, with that, towns across the United States have been adopting various zoning codes to help uh, have good zoning codes in place for their growth and prosperity. Um, in the state of Oklahoma specifically, uh, under Title 11 is where, of course, as you guys know, underneath municipal law, Title 11 provides for various aspects of building and zoning for each community. A lot of communities have planning commissions that are wrapped into zoning boards. There are some communities that have specifically a zoning board and a planning commission associated with that. So this creates the planning commission's roles and responsibilities as it relates to the community. So we have a general plan, or what's called a land use plan. We'll get into more in depth about that as a comprehensive plan. The planning commission is also responsible for specific plans that may be necessary for its function, and so they are given the authority through the town board or through the city council to take additional actions on their own. Oftentimes, that generally is a district plan or a research study. So that's one of the neat things is that a lot of communities and a lot of planning commissions don't do is that they think of themselves as being just a board to review something and kind of move on. But I have tried through my various expertise through at Rogers and at Broken Arrow and soon to be at Bartlesville. Oh, by the way, I've been at Bartlesville for 3 months. So if I slip up and say Broken Arrow or something along those lines, they all begin with a B, just like how Tammy has said. But and I try my best. I always try to say my previous community, so that way. And I get heckled by that at Bartlesville all the time because they're like, just say Broken Arrow, you're here, just say how it is at BA. But so in Broken Arrow, we use that opportunity specifically with Airbnbs. The city of Broken Arrow had moved forward with a code several years ago for Airbnbs. We didn't have one at the time. We kind of had watched to see how the city of Tulsa was working out with theirs through their board of adjustment, and knew that that was something that, and knew that they were going to be changing and updating their code as well. But we had created a code, seeing what they had done, basically required, there were 3 to 4 levels that were created. There was the first level, which was if you lived in your house, you could have a Airbnb as long as you live there. You come in, get a specific use permit from the Board of Adjustment, which would be required, or from the Planning Commission, which require a public hearing, and notices would go out, 300-foot radius, yada yada yada. That would happen for these 3 phases. So the first one was for that. The second one was for if you wanted to have more than one room that was still required. And then there was level 3, which was if you want to rent it out a house and you didn't live there. And then there was level 4, which was a general commercial Airbnb, aka downtown. It was an old house. It's now 8 rooms. You serve breakfast, that kind of thing. The standard model that everyone saw back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Since that time, though, they enacted the law, and then we would get 1 or 2 cases coming in. But we would get a lot of complaints from citizens about these Airbnbs going in because they would complain about the noise or complain that there was a big party going on or something along those lines. And so what we did is that we looked into a specific piece of software, the Granicus software company, which I know some communities utilize for managing their agendas and cases. So we used Granicus, and they monitored all the Airbnbs, because that's the thing, whenever they're out there on the website, you don't know when they're up and when they're down. And so you can only get a generalization of how many Airbnbs you have in your community. So in Broken Arrow, we had about 200, give or take, at any given time. And so, they were, in a sense, violating our laws that we had in place for Airbnbs and also for our hotel motel tax. So we went through the process, and we started getting inundated because the company would send out notices and remind them that, hey, you got to come in and get a specific use permit. And so they got caught, essentially. And so we got notifications out. And so they started coming in, and our planning commission became inundated with these specific use permits or special exceptions, or whatever you want to call them in your community. Inundated. We would have 10 to 15 every planning commission. In Broken Arrow, we have planning commission meetings every 2 weeks. And so we just kept getting them. And, the planning commission was getting really irritated by this, because that was taking up a lot of time that could be better devoted, because it was rare to ever turn one down. And if it turned one down, it's because they didn't provide enough information as a requirement of the application, or it was these little things, or things that are part of the application process that the applicant had not met. It was rare for them to ever turn one down. So, they started saying it as, well, this is ridiculous. And so I reminded the planning commission, I was like, you have the authority, if you want to have staff to review these cases and to review the ordinance. And you also have the authority to create your own committee. And so, it's reminding the planning commission that they have more than just a case that comes before them, they look at it, and then they go home. It's that they are to be engaged as a part of the community, to be engaged as a part of the process. So to wrap up that story, is that the planning commission ultimately created a committee. They reviewed it, and they determined that if anything met certain requirements, is that they no longer had to come in and get a specific use permit. They simply had to get a license from the city that would be monitored every year. And if they were in violation of any of the ordinances that were in place for short-term rentals, that their license would be revoked, that they would have to come back. If they wanted to continue, they would have to come back to the planning commission through a public hearing process. And if they had violated that process, or violated even after getting that one, then they would not be allowed to have an Airbnb. So it worked out exceptionally well, because it streamlined the process immensely. Everyone got to where they needed to be, and so it was that process. But what was great is that it wasn't a requirement that someone had to go to the city council. It was initiated by the planning commission. So it's just, let your planning commission, if you have the opportunity, let them be the guide of how to give some input on the ordinances they have in place. So they can investigate, make recommendations, practical means and implement a general plan, promote public health interest and understanding of the general public, hold public hearings for zoning, make recommendations to council, make recommendations on updating the zoning map, decide any questions involving interpretation, the application, and provision of the zoning ordinance, except for the planning commission does not have the authority on the definition portion of it. So typically, a planning commission, or let's say I as the director, because usually somewhere in the code it says the director, which is usually, in the definition is actually the city manager or his designee, which is usually the director of community development. We'll go through, and so they'll make a determination on an interpretation. And if someone is not in agreement with that, then it doesn't really go to the planning commission, it actually goes to the board of adjustment, because the board of adjustment makes that determination. But the planning commission can be asked for clarification in the sense of, is this zoning classification the best use for here, or in some communities with a less intensity use. So let's say I was asking for some communities have C5 or CH, and there's a provision in the ordinance that says, is this, the planning commission can be asked by both the applicant and the public, is this highest intensity, the C5, really the best, or should it be C4 or C3 or CG or one of those other designations? And the planning commission can make that determination and recommendation as a part of that. Purpose of the comprehensive plan, and we'll talk more about this later. Just because I had a fun night last night, I do want to share that story with you, with the town that I was in yesterday. Not Bartlesville. So the purpose of the comprehensive plan is to create a roadmap for the community. A comprehensive plan can be any way, shape, form, design. There is no required format for any community to have. It can be anything you'd like. So for Broken Arrow, for years, utilized this form of a comprehensive plan using land use intensity. It's actually quite excellent. I will give it kudos for that. But when you're in a community that is small, or a county, or some other government organization like that, it's not a requirement to get into this depth. The comprehensive plan can give general guidelines on when we have commercial development, we should encourage landscape going in, or shall require landscape going in, or something along those lines. So that way, whenever the zoning code gets updated, the information that's provided by the comp plan can be incorporated into the zoning code. So going back for a second, it creates goals, objectives, policies, guides development, clarify future land use, and establishes a future network plan and utility plan. You can also go into great, more in-depth details. I know in Colorado, their comprehensive plans are incredibly detailed whenever it comes to economic and ecological development that is going on within the cities and counties. For example, I know in Colorado, they for their protection of grasslands and things along those lines, those are really incorporated into those comprehensive plans to help have more protections associated with them. But again, each community is different. This comprehensive plan should not be a template that is copied and pasted into this comprehensive plan. Every comprehensive plan should be created for each community. So like I was saying, this is Broken Arrows that was adopted in 2008, updated in 2012, and this has since been replaced by the 2017 comprehensive plan and updated. So I kept this in there just because I didn't need to go back and really capture what in 2017, because this is essentially still very, very much the same. So this is what's called the land use map, or Lewis level program, which is the land use intensity system. So you can see here is that it looks kind of like a zoning map. It has purple that indicates industrial, red that's commercial, yellow that's residential, and green that's for agricultural or for parkland or potentially floodplain protection. But the concept of the comprehensive plan is to, if you think of this as a section piece that you see here, four corners of major streets, that you have the higher intensity on the corners and the lower intensity towards the central. So typically you would see commercial, Quick Trip, Starbucks, whatever. They're in the level 4. Level 3 would be office or apartments, multifamily, and then 2 would be residential. And so then the land use plan, this specific one, gives the levels associated with it and gives recommendations when someone comes in and asks, saying, hey, I want to put in a commercial development, and it'll show up as red. And so red is level 4. Level 4 will then say, well, these zoning applications are allowed or recommended by the comprehensive plan. Some may be possible through a PUD process. But in Rogers County, still currently, the comprehensive plan there is very broad, to where it actually gives miles of area along a corridor of a highway, and it gives loosely based recommendations that it is recommended that commercial go on intersection corners. Residential development should be more towards the center, and it's very, very broad strokes, because you're talking about, instead of planning for 64 square miles, now you're planning for 724 square miles. So the code has to be kind of flexible to allow for that flexibility. Plus, at the time when it was adopted back in oh good lord, that one was adopted back in 2004. The technology at the time was not as advanced as it is now, to where we can get down to a microcosm level. So implementing tools. So there's the comprehensive plan. That is not an ordinance. I'm sure a lot of you guys know that. Is that under state law, Title 11 became codified in law that the community should have a comprehensive plan in 1977. But what's interesting in Title 19, Section 866 and 65 and 63, where like Tulsa's TMAPC, Tulsa Metropolitan Area Planning Commission, those were actually required back in 1955. And those are actually even stronger requirements, saying that the community shall have a comprehensive plan and shall have all these things, where Title 11, it just gives you the option of having a comprehensive plan, and is not so much as a requirement. Anyways, so the comp plan is the tool for long-range planning. Then you have the actual ordinance. So you have the zoning code, the subdivision regulation, which is an ordinance, and then in Broken Arrow, and in some communities, I believe Owasso as well, you have engineering design standards. In a lot of communities up until roughly 2000, all the engineering design standards were incorporated into the subdivision regulations. Well, as we know, when you're building roads or water or anything along those lines, you're not going to be able to design specifically to the ordinance requirement, aka your standard requirement for a road grade is 10%. So, your slope is 10%. You can't have anything more than that. Well, if I come across an area that I need to go to 11%, it's not that I can simply go and use good engineering practices to ensure that whenever I do go to 11%, that I'm doing something different to help mitigate that. Whenever it's in the subdivision regulations, I now have to go and amend the ordinance. I have to go to Planning Commission to make a recommendation, to go to council just to make that tweak. So back in 2000, the city of Broken Arrow, through Kenny Schwab and other people at the city, decided to rip apart the two and create engineering design standards and subdivision regulations, where the subdivision regulations specifically talk about how to plat a piece of property, how to divide it up, put it on a map, and plot it out. The engineering design standards then can be interpreted as a policy and a non-ordinance regulation that can be interpreted or given to the city engineer for interpretation and implementation. So that way, when you do come across these things, it no longer becomes a huge burden to have to go through the process of just trying to make a slight change in a street. Zoning ordinance, you have there's a standard zoning ordinance that you just have regular districts. So you have agricultural, residential, office, commercial, industrial. Other communities also have education parks and industrial parks, and specific zoning districts for like Stillwater may have a university district or something along those lines. There's also planning and development. Broken Arrow has roughly about 360, I think we're up to in BA, roughly. I know Tulsa was getting close to, I think, 2,000. And then you have overlay districts, which typically go in historical areas or go along corridors of highways. And it is kind of interesting is that when we start getting into planning unit developments, they're supposed to be designed for specific situations, basically creating its own zoning code overlay. That can be very beneficial, which is great. It's supposed to be designed to help create a whole set of, to take basically, 300 acres and develop it out into its own fully developed commercial and residential, whole life living district kind of thing. But so often the PUDs are utilized for little things like my house is over the setback by 1 foot. I can go to the Board of Adjustment and ask for a variance, but because it doesn't meet the requirement of the Board of Adjustment, because I created the issue, then I can go to the planning commission and create a PUD just for that one specific little thing, and everything is legal then. That happens, and that's the thing, is that it can be utilized for that. The way that Broken Arrow is moving forward with their update of their zoning ordinance is that we're doing everything we can to take these things that have been used as for PUDs and incorporate into our new zoning code, aka I want to have higher density housing. If I want to have higher density housing, what do we typically do? We do a PUD, then that requires additional landscaping, setbacks, yada, yada, yada. Well, if we're going to go through that process, which we've done 50 times through a PUD process, why not just incorporate into the code and then, be done with it? And so that's what Broken Arrow is doing moving forward, is so that way we don't have to have so many PUDs. That has become the standard of our zoning, standard of our comprehensive plan, and so that way we move forward with it. Broken Arrow has several overlay districts. They have the Rose District overlay, which is downtown, which is the downtown residential overlay district, which is weird that we incorporate residential because it also incorporates commercial uses. But it has been fantastic in helping put new residential development within the city of Broken Arrow, because if we had stayed with our standard residential zoning types, the new houses going in, and they were just like houses out of the subdivision. Where the new houses that are going in now actually match the style of the houses that are in there. So they have the craftsman style, they're beautiful, they fit, and they make sense. And so by having that overlay district, it actually helps save the character of the community and help those that were living there for years and years and years feel comfortable with their new neighbors that were coming in versus the standard subdivision type houses that were coming in up to that point. I'm sure, as you know, zoning ordinance content by right and by specific use. We at Broken Arrow have these same thing at Bartlesville, have these columns of uses, and then we go across to the zoning districts and say, is it a use by right with a P, or does it need a specific use permit? Or if it is a right with a P, are there certain standards that it needs to play whenever it comes into place? And so it has that specific use standard column as well. Ordinance by content also provides for setback standards, so building setback requirements for all of our districts. So zoning, I know that's kind of small, but it would have the front setback, side setback. We don't have bulk and area requirements in Broken Arrow as much, because by having the setbacks, it automatically creates the bulk and area requirements, where the bulk and area requirements, you actually can come into a great formula. And that kind of becomes confusing for a lot of citizens, where if they just have these, your house has to set back 20 feet from your property line from the front, and 5 and 10 on the sides and 30 on the back, they're like, I get that. Instead of you having to go through this calculation and say you cannot cover your lot more than this percentage and yada, yada, yada. So by having the yards, it automatically creates the minimum lot coverage area / maximum. So in the zoning ordinance, it talks about parking minimum maximum requirements. In the new zoning code update in Broken Arrow, they are moving towards really letting the users kind of dictate that, because so oftentimes you look at the older portions of the city. If you ever get a chance to go to Broken Arrow, the New Orleans district, the area was built in the 1980s, and there's nothing but a parking lot for miles around. It was that way in Midwest City, but before they did their reconstruction. And there are areas of Oklahoma City and Tulsa as well that have that. But by having those parking requirements, the city itself is now creating more, impervious surface, creates more of a problem with stormwater runoff and everything like that. Where if you listen to the actual company that's coming in, because they're not going to make less parking for themselves, they're not going to harm themselves for having reduced parking, is that they're going to say, hey, I really don't need 30 parking spots, I only need 25. It's like, well, obviously you know what you're wanting to do to be successful, so that's good for you, it's good for us. And so that's the way how Broken Arrow and probably how Bartlesville will be going as well. Landscaping standards, parking lot lighting, sign regulations, that has been a very big one. As we know, Broken Arrow had to go through and update their sign regulations. Bartlesville is going to be doing the same, as I have discovered, is that their sign regulations have not been updated since the case out of Arizona. So we're going through that process. access controls, design requirements, and legal nonconformity uses. I highly recommend that whenever, if you can at all possible, if it's something that doesn't need to be in the zoning code, don't put it in the zoning code. There are times where we talk about, um, you know, potentially architectural standards and things along those lines. There are things that are in there that doesn't necessarily need to be in there. We also had pet licensing in there for a period of time. It's, why is that in the zoning code? I mean, yeah, animal use, get it, understand, but at the same time, that can be, in the what we refer to as the Green Book or Muni Code. It's just, if you don't have to put it in the zoning code, please don't put it in the zoning code. Zoning maps, I'm sure everyone is accustomed to seeing that. I know people have different colors for different things. Standard is, red for commercial, yellow for residential, gray for industrial, that kind of use. Process for, this is something that's typical process for zoning process is an applicant will come in and say, I want to rezone something. Ordinance requires, if it's commercial, to be within 300 feet or residential within 300 feet. And this is an argument that Tammy and I have had, and I've had with others at Broken Arrow, is that there is a section in state law that says that if you have multifamily that is utilized for drug rehab, research, and things along those lines, that you have to notify within a quarter of a mile. And that's where a lot of communities have adopted that, because it has the word multifamily, that no matter what, even if it's not utilized for drug rehab or anything like that, that you have to notify within a quarter of a mile. And that is a problem, because now we're creating a type of segregation of different type of residential uses. I'm happy to have that debate more. I'm encouraging, as part of Broken Arrow and a part of Bartlesville zoning code update, is that we eliminate that quarter mile requirement of notification. The reason why we still carry it forward in Broken Arrow is because it is actually within the ordinance that for apartments that we notify, but it derives from that original statute underneath Title 11 and also underneath Title 19. Legal notice goes out 20 days prior to it. It's actually so that's a higher standard in Broken Arrow, 20 days. In state laws, it's actually only 15 days. And so, depending on what you want to do, you can always, as you know, have a higher standard. Just can have less, and then notice posted on the property, which is also interestingly optional. That is only required for certain things, but again, because it's in our ordinance, we post on the property. But it does state that the town or the city may post a sign on the property, and that shall be there for 7 days, where in Broken Arrow it was 10 days. So good. It's interesting little notes that you don't necessarily, that you can look at whenever you're looking at updating your code. Here's an example of notices that go out. This is very typical. It usually is very general. Try not to be specific. We got in trouble with that in Broken Arrow one time, where we said that all we said was 264 units were coming into the city of Broken Arrow for multifamily, and it turned out it was 268. And because we put in the notice of 264, 66, it became a non-valid notice. And so we had to go through the whole process over again. So when you're making your notices and everything like that, keep it as general as possible, AKA what is being asked for, RM zoning, with or without a PUD. Just state that. Do not put anything else in it. You may be like, oh, I'm trying to help the public understand, and put the bare minimum in there, because that way it keeps you out of trouble as much as possible. That was a very expensive thing to learn. Public meeting, again, for communities that have staff, staff creates staff reports. They provide those staff reports to the planning commission members. Some communities, Broken Arrow and Bartlesville included, staff will make a recommendation to the planning commission and to city council. Some other communities, they choose not to, and that is simply up to the community to decide so that way it is not viewed that staff is telling the planning commission to make a decision in one way, but instead is just providing information. So agenda reports are posted, staff presentation by the applicant, and public hearing. I have been called a communist, so I'm just letting you know that. Even though I don't carry my card with me all the time. No, I'm kidding. Purpose of the subdivision regulations. This is a standard requirement throughout all of the laws in the state of Oklahoma for all municipalities that engage in planning commissions, is that they are required to have a process for platting a piece of property. So this is very typical. Requires for the zoning regulations, ensure subdivision minimum lot size requirements that are reflected of the zoning district are in place, easements, the right of ways for public roads and streets and infrastructure. All those are listed on the plat, so that way it gives clear direction on who's responsible for what, where, why, and how. This has been very interesting. Is that I go from one community to another, and in Broken Arrow, we do very detailed plats. We put what the zoning regulation is. We put that in there. We also require specific language in there about the dedication of right of way and everything like that. Bartlesville, it's completely different. It's one page, typically, of the plat, and all it does is when we reference those sections, we reference the ordinance. So it keeps it very short, but that's also very concerning, because then you have to play the paper trail of, okay, that was created in 1976. I have to go find the ordinance in 1976. What did it relate there? Oh, it says I need to go back and look at the ordinance in 1952, and it's becomes a paper trail trace. Every community is different, and that's why you have to kind of observe and see what that is. But whatever fits best for you is fine, as long as it meets the minimum requirements of the state statute. So typically, there is, in most communities, there's what's called a preliminary plat and a final plat. Preliminary plat is reviewed by Planning Commission, and then the person goes out and does the work, and then the final plat goes to City Council or to the Board of County Commissioners. In some communities, they'll have what's called a conceptual plat that will go first, and then what we call a preliminary plat. And in Broken Arrow, they had a conditional final plat. So this is an example of preliminary plat. And then they have a conditional final plat that would then go to the City Council, and then the City Council will give the authority to the mayor to sign the final plat. So that way the final plat didn't have to come back before them. But in most communities, as I'm sure you're aware, is that preliminary plat goes to Planning Commission, final plat goes to Council, and that is it. There is that's the typical process. So in summation of that section, of all that is just, there's the Planning Commission rules, there's the comprehensive plan, zoning ordinance, and subdivision regulations. Now, to get to what I wanted to talk to you about is just, this happened to me yesterday. So I work for towns, but I also have side gig work that I help small communities. And I really enjoy that, because I enjoy working with little towns that are needing help. And it's because it's that one-on-one level that you get that you really don't get at larger communities, is that you get to talk to the mayor, who also has the store that sells donuts and things like that. It's really, really cool to get to them. But that being said, the town of Ergoris is going through their comprehensive plan process. We've been working on it for about a little over 7 months now. We have reached out to the movers and shakers of the community to get some input from them, reached out to nonprofits and religious organizations to get their input, schools and whatnot. We did an online survey. We got 130 respondents, which is fantastic for a town of 5,000. We were really pleased to get that back and information, but we still, of course, need to have a public meeting to get public. People don't all have computers, so we need to get a public meeting going. So we did. We created 7 boards that had quality of life, parks and recreation, transportation, mobility, and all those great things. And I sent out the notices to all the newspapers and all the news outlets and whatnot to try to get as many people to come in as possible. We had about 30 people that showed up yesterday, but unfortunately for us, Rogers County had also been doing their comprehensive plan, and they did not have as much community input, and they had it before their planning commission for adoption, and that's when people had noticed it a lot more. And what they had noticed was keywords that were in there. Now, it is my job as a consultant, and it is my job as staff to be neutral. I have no political affiliations. I have nothing. I am there to simply guide and provide information. But there were key words that came up as a part of the conversation that was very concerning to that community, specifically the word comprehensive plan, specifically word conserve, specifically word locally led, and sustain. And so I'm just bringing this as an FYI when you have things that come up, is that this may become before you as well as you go through the process. And I'm sure everyone has heard of Agenda 21. I learned yesterday of 3030. I did not know about that one, and so I learned about that. But there is this preconceived notion because Agenda 21, specifically on the UN website, says Agenda 21 is a comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally and nationally, yada, yada, yada. So when the citizens saw Verdigris comprehensive plan, they automatically assumed this was Agenda 21 coming to the Verdigris community. So out of those 30 people that showed up yesterday, about 25 of them were very concerned about this. There was no yelling match. I did get, at the beginning of it, was very concerned that either I worked for the United Nations or I worked for the Biden administration, one or the other. I do not work for either. I promise you that. And then what had bled over from the county was the word sustain, conserve, conservation. And in the county's comprehensive plan, they were making a recommendation that trails should go throughout the county and connect the communities together. What this particular group did not like is that they were concerned about having to do eminent domain to go through their property in order to make those connections. So yesterday's meeting was a fact-finding meeting, and so I spent 20 minutes going through this and explaining who I was, where I was from. No, I'm not from out of town. No, I'm not from Washington. No, I'm not from the United Nations, and going through the whole process and just simply talking to them and listening to their concerns and reassuring them that no document had been created, because they actually had not caught us, that sounds really bad, but they actually had gotten in the right moment, that if those really are the concerns that you have, is that, don't put trails as a part of the Verdigris Comprehensive Plan. If that is something that is very concerning to you, and what I was able to talk to them about is like, what are your guys' thoughts about trails going along existing roadways where there's already public right-of-way that's been dedicated? And they're like, oh, well, we're fine with that. We just don't want our property taken, because their concern under this 3030 plan is that the government will go out and grab 30% of the land from the United States and put it into trust and yada, yada, yada. And they were concerned that the local government was a part of that process to go out and take land away from them. So it's all about ensuring that communication, having that concern of listening to their issues and reassuring them as much as possible that your staff is local, they're here representing you. Don't let your consultant, that sounds like I'm shooting myself in the foot on that one too. Anyway, don't let your consultant run the show, because that's the worst thing that can happen. When you have someone that has no clue about what your community is, it goes down really quick. We had that problem in Broken Arrow with our zoning ordinance update, is that our consultant was saying X, Y, and Z, and I was sitting in the back and I would have to get up every 2 minutes and say, okay, to take that into context of how that applies to the city of Broken Arrow, this is what they're saying. And be like, oh, okay, because again, we have a council that is very concerned about particular issues, and it's just making sure that you're a part of the process. Don't let your consultant run the show as much as possible. But anyway, so I just want to bring that to your attention. Happy to talk more about that offline. I got the signal of 3 minutes, so I'm happy to take any questions now or afterwards.